And this is, I think, the cutting edge. I think denominationalism, we've got to put it to one side. You know, when I was growing up in the 1950s, Catholics hated Protestants, but Protestants hated Catholics even more, you know, because they kept saying we were Mary worshippers and stuff like this. And we used to fight each other. You know, I mean, it's unreal to think that within my lifetime, you know, I go around these groups with my students, they don't care about denominationalism. As I said, most of them don't even have religious backgrounds of any persuasion. So for them, Catholic versus Protestant is a completely dead issue. They're not even interested in it. And as one student said to me last year, and I felt very moved by this, for us, all that matters is, do you believe in God or not? We're not concerned about what stripe or colour of it, whether it's, you know, Hindu, Muslim, Catholic, Uniting Church, Anglican. We're only concerned about whether or not you feel the presence of something else in our lives. And that something else is, I think, what we tend to refer to as God. One of my students, I'm learning from students all the while. Some of my colleagues said, isn't it your job to teach them? And I said, no, it's not actually. If you understand what education is, and then of course, and then they go, oh, here he goes again. You know, if I could give just a short interpretation of what education is from Latin. Latin's very important. Educare in Latin means to draw out from within. It doesn't mean pouring the glass, the jug of water into empty heads. That's what I think my teachers thought it meant in the 1950s. Education is telling someone how to do things, giving them information. The true meaning of education, edu, care, to draw out what is within. So in fact, the role of the teacher is not, in fact, constantly to impart knowledge, although we do that as a byproduct, but is actually partly to draw out what's in people. And so I draw out, what I try to draw out in my teaching is the presence of God, where God is not only not noticed, but also not named as such. And in Australia, God is mostly not named. As Peter said in his introduction, I'm trained in Jungian depth psychology. Jung, of course, was a disciple of Freud and broke away from Freud because Freud had too negative an approach to religion. Jung wanted to regard, Jung, of course, was the son of a Protestant minister, a Lutheran in Switzerland, and he regarded religion very highly, whereas Freud, a lot like Marx or Nietzsche, saw religion as simply a delusion. So Richard Dawkins, with his recent work called The God Delusion, which is having so much influence, I think, in Australia today, unfortunately, is all he's doing is rehashing ideas that are about 150 or 200 years old that are coming out of the philosophical tradition. I've not personally met Richard Dawkins. I would certainly like to, because one of the things that strikes me as flawed in his work, and I've recently read a terrific book called The Dawkins Delusion. So I really recommend it. What he does is he takes very fake and false ideas of God and blows them out of the water and thinks that he's destroyed religion. In fact, he takes an idea of God, which I think many Australian people have in their minds. When you say to people, do you believe in God? In my experience as a university professor, most people say no. That's their first response. I was brought up to Sydney. I come up to Sydney all the time. I said to one of my daughters yesterday, I see Sydney more than I see Melbourne. I don't know why this is the case. I came up a couple of years ago for the ABC, and they were trying to form a debate between believers and non-believers. And they couldn't think of a believer. Can you imagine that? They can't think of a believer. So they thought, oh, David Tacey. Oh, yes, we'll get him up from Melbourne. So back on the plane, I almost know these Qantas flight attendants by their first name now. And I was seated in a room at University of Sydney with Philip Adams, who was looking very gruff. You know, he's the arch atheist of Australia, and he is in fact affiliated member of the Atheist Society. And he had someone on his, he had two people on his side of the debate who were arguing for the non-existence of God. And I had two people I'd never met before who were from somewhere around Sydney who were on my side. But they were ancillary, and so it was Philip and me head to head. And during this conversation, Philip was saying, God doesn't exist, and if he does exist, he's a bastard, because he does so much evil in the world and things go wrong, it's not a perfect world. And, you know, he was really launching out in very blasphemous ways. And then during the break, I asked him off air, because, you know, you can't say on the ABC, and now we go for an ad break, because there aren't any ad breaks. So they have to just cut, and then they'll pick it up a minute later. During the break, I said to Philip, why are you so angry about God? And he told me a brief story. Believe it or not, he was born and raised where I live, Eltham, in northeast Melbourne. His father was a minister in the Church of Christ who was dying of cancer, unfortunately. When he was quite young, he was 5 years old. And the Church of Christ, I don't know anything about the Church of Christ, but I should find out. They gathered prayer groups to try and pray that Philip's father would be saved and there could be a remission of cancer. And I think Philip said he joined one of the prayer groups. He was very much a devoted, son to his father. And then his father's health deteriorated and he didn't recover. And I think very soon after, by the time Philip was 6, his dad died. And he has 6-year-old anger at God about this. And I said, Philip, because he's older than me, I'm 60, Philip's 72. I said, Philip, you're now 72 and you've still got a 5-year-old's anger at God. I said, have you thought about giving it up? You know, have you thought about confessing it to someone, talking to a chaplain? And he said, no, I hate them all. It's all just a delusion. There's no God out there. And I said to him, again off air, I said, yet I find you a very spiritual person. He said, how so? I said, well, along with Malcolm Fraser, you set up Care Australia, which is an overseas care organisation. You're involved in social justice. You always get interesting people on your program to talk about how to change the world for the better. And he said, and I said, I think you're doing very important spiritual work. And he looked at me and pointed and he said, if you say that on air, I'll sue you, you bastard. You know? I'll sue you if you say that on air. And so I didn't say it on there, but after we came back and started the photography again of the film, he began his next foray, attack on God, saying he had the spirituality of a clothesline. And this was supposed to be a joke. And I said, a clothesline? And then he said, no, I'll change the metaphor. I have the spirituality of a house brick. And I said, oh, Philip, this is quite silly. I think that, and then I came up with a statement, which I'm pleased I came up with, because it's going to be the title of my next book. And I said to him, Philip, the God you don't believe in never did exist. And that threw him. He said, I've never thought of that. And I said, you're involved in an image of God, which is a 5-year-old idea of God. You actually think there's a Superman type figure up on a cloud who's watching over things and can manipulate things to his own ends. He said, yeah, I do feel that that's what God is. And I felt suddenly in the room of the presence of the holy, because I'd actually exposed the fake idol that he thought was God. And I can remember my skin rippling and creeping in this moment. And it's caught on TV. It's a very interesting moment. And I almost, if it was a wrestling match, I almost threw him to the mat, you know. And sort of, ding, 1 point to me, you know. The God you don't believe in never did exist.